this is me. I'm John Stevenson. What do I do? The question what works. So I've been doing a lot of work with sort of running the Limited Whip Society, which is the Kanban community in London. There's also quite a few Limited Whip Societies around the world as well. So we talk about Kanban and how we can use that to be more effective. So essentially, this talk is how to be more effective, how to kind of get into more of a just-in-time kind of creation of work. So you're actually doing the work you're doing the software development in a timely way, and it's kind of delivered within a reasonable amount of time that you're writing it, because it's more effective to deploy stuff pretty soon after you've created it, because if there's a problem, then you find out more and you can do more about it to adjust that, adjust any issue. So I've been doing it for quite a while, so hopefully I'm trying to get over some of that experience. I've been doing the teams and training people and so on. When I have time, I dabble with a little bit of Clojure as well, so a functional programming language, which I find a very agile kind of way to write code as well. So a couple of goals really, to get over the sort of basics of Kanban and show you how you can really kind of be more effective or get more effective in what you're doing to be able to code, ship code in a more timely fashion, and visualize what it is that's stopping you doing that. We want to build all these really great software applications, software systems, but there's a lot of work to do. Our employers are usually pushing us to do more and more all the time, and something is always urgent coming up, something's always a priority, even though everything can't really be a priority, but everything seems to be. You go there and you have a really bad week and you've got like 100 priorities, everything has to be shipped all at once, and you just know you can't do that, but you don't have the time to explain that back to your manager or the business, and they just think that you aren't able to do your job and you don't feel so great yourself. So how do you actually manage the expectations effectively without spending a lot of time doing project management, project planning, planning poker, stuff like all these kind of tasks may be useful, but are they actually helping, or are you just spending time thinking about doing something rather than actually doing it? So a lot of times you can miss opportunities if you can't see how things are actually working in your organization. Then how do you know how you're actually going to improve something if you don't fully understand how things are working? So just the curiosity, how many hours do you actually work a week? Who works about an average of about 40 hours a week? Most people. Who thinks they work 50 hours or more? Who works about 20 hours, 30 hours? No. So we all think we work about 40 hours a week. That seems about reasonable. So the question is, how many of those hours do you actually think you're actually being productive? If you think about all the telephone calls, or the emails you get, or the distractions, or the status meetings, all the things that happen while you're at work, how many of those 40 hours do you actually think you're being effective? Any clues? Feedback?
Half. That's 35.
About 35 hours?
10.
10 hours? That's more likely. So I think a lot of the agile practitioners, in a 40-hour week, they say for maybe 20 to 24 hours of that week, you're actually productive. And the rest of the time, you're not. You're doing other activities to support those hours, those 24 hours. So when your manager comes along and it says, well, we need to work harder, we need to get more done, it's kind of like the more hours you put, if you put in 60 hours, then you'll maybe get up to 30 hours of productivity. So you're in a never-ending spiral of not being able to do more because you're not thinking about how you're actually doing it in the first place. So this is really what Kanban is about, to try and get you to think about the process, how you're doing things, how you're getting things done, trying to avoid things like multitasking, trying to make things visible so you can actually see the flow of work through your organization. And there's this idea of pull that we actually get. So rather than people coming along saying we must do that. You understand the system from the end point of view. So you can deploy something, so when you're ready to deploy something, you can pull the next thing to deploy, which triggers off you actually doing some more testing, which then triggers off you doing some more development, so on. So you're actually doing the work at the speed somebody else is consuming, so your customer. So overall, it helps you understand the bigger picture. So I like to kind of do a little analogy with Subway. Have we all been to Subway and bought their delicious sandwiches?
Subway and bought their sandwiches.
Okay. there's an honest appraisal. They're quite nice. Whether you like their sandwiches or not, it's an interesting model of how you get served. If you actually look at it, there are one or more resources there that will actually process the various stages for assembling your sandwich, which again is a very loose analogy of how most people go about writing software. So in software you analyze, you have roles that actually are involved in producing software. Here you have people kind of doing different tasks, so preparing the bread, putting the filling in, and so on. And when it's really busy, then you have several people all doing specific roles, and they do their task and pass it on. And typically you're kind of doing one sandwich at a time. And it's very effective. You can actually go in and see the queue. Say there's 20 people in line for a Subway sandwich. You can actually stand there and watch them. And you actually watch time of 2-3 people going through and getting their sandwich. And you can actually calculate from that short piece of evidence how long it's actually going to take you to wait in the queue, because it's very predictable how long each sandwich takes roughly the same amount of time. So therefore, even if there's 20 people waiting, you know, say if it takes a minute, then you know that you're going to get your sandwich within 15 to 20 minutes. So it's quite a nice way to think about being an effective way of delivering something to your customer. In this case, it's a sandwich. In your case, it's software. And there are some other analogies, such as in Subway, everything's kind of color-coded, so it's very easy to see when the stocks are low and which things are tomatoes and so on as well. So again, you can use those kind of ideas on the Kanban board. We'll talk about that in a minute. So it kind of raises a situation where everything's visualized. You can see what's going on. If there's an issue, you can kind of address it. If there's low bread stocks, you can kind of address that. Somebody can come along and help out in that particular area. You can continuously improve, so if there's a lack of ingredients, then you can actually select another one, because you can see what's going on. You can interact with that process very easily. So you're almost the manager of that software development team, except it's a sandwich delivery team. Does that make sense? So in software, this is a typical, if there is such thing as a typical Kanban board. So you can have these post-it notes or some cards that represent stories or tasks that you're actually going to do, and they basically move from one side of the board to the other. And that's as simple and as complex as it can be. You can have different coloured cards for different activities, different kind of stories, if you've got epics and so on and so on. So it's really up to you how you define the Kanban board. And if you get the team who's actually representing their work on the Kanban board to design that board, then it's not an imposition on what they're doing. They're defining, they're expressing how they're working. It's not somebody else trying to define what their process is. They're saying, well, this is how it works, this is our reality, and we're making it visual, so that people can come along and we can come along and see what goes wrong, because there's always something that goes wrong. So it's really a wall of facts, essentially. And it's really kind of there to help you understand how an idea is turned into reality for your customers. So this is the idea of value stream mapping, so working out all the activities that you do to actually get something done. And it's just an excuse to put some Ben and Stimpy stuff on there as well. Which so one of the things it does, it really highlights some of the issues that you will actually get. And it's quite common that you'll have a big stack of software that's waiting to deploy. You'll have a lot of stories that are visually obvious that all these stories have kind of sat there in the deployment queue. And somebody can come along and say, well, ask the question, well, why is this the case? We wrote this several weeks ago, but it's still in the queue to be deployed. So what can we actually do about that situation? And when you try something, when you actually try implement an improvement, you can actually see visually on the board whether it's actually having any effect. Sometimes it'll have a good effect, sometimes it may have a bad effect. But either way, you've actually learned something. You've actually learned something about the way you do something, the way you are able to do something with the resources that you have. So how I started really was with this idea of plan, doing, done. So you plan something, you plan what you're going to do, you do it, and then you're done. Using that way, it's a very simple model. It gets you to think about doing one thing at once, which is an effective way of doing things. Trying to multitask, even for computers, it's hard, but for humans, we just don't do it. We like to think that we multitask, but we're very bad at it, and it's very difficult to be effective, because if we start doing a task, especially a thought task, well, it's something we have to really think about, then as we start thinking about something and we get interrupted, a lot of that thinking is gone. Because then when we come back to that task, we end up going over that thinking again to get back into understanding that task. So the more you jump between tasks, the more ineffective you are. And this is where some of that extra time of your 40 weeks disappears to. It's thinking time, because you get interrupted and you have to do the thinking time all over again before you can actually do the doing. So you can do very simple things like this. I've done this on basically on my fridge with my girlfriend. When we were organising sort of moving house, we actually did a very simple Kanban board, and it saved an awful lot of grief. And we're still together, so that helped. So it does work. There's empirical evidence that it helps your relationships. And it was a great way to communicate. We were both very busy, we were both very hectic with our own work, then we tried to kind of do some moving as well. So we organised, we planned what we needed to do, we indicated who was doing what, so we didn't duplicate any work. We could we could highlight things that were more important than the other. We could very easily decide on priorities from the list of things we wanted to do. If we wanted to do something, we needed to do something, we could quickly write it down and put it on the fridge, and then we could forget about it and go off and do something that was more important. So we didn't have to spend time thinking about it or worrying about forgetting it. Some of the agile people also think about this plan, do, check, act cycle. I use this for when I'm trying to learn something. So I did also do a talk about just-in-time learning, how to learn something in a timely fashion. And this is a very useful model to do. So you plan something, you do it, you check you've actually done it, and then you act on anything you've learned about how to do it better next time. So sometimes this is kind of analogous to doing sort of test-driven development as well, except with a slightly different order. So in software development, you've got the traditional kind of style, or people kind of do more of this change around the development and the specifications, so developing automated specifications, and then going into development, and then developing against those automated specifications, so like acceptance tests. And again, you can see whether doing a more traditional style or a modern style, how that kind of affects your ability to get something done. So a useful thing to do is to check when is something ready. So if you're working on something and you finish, what do you do next? There could be, if you've got a huge backlog, or even if you've got 10 stories in a sprint, then that's still a lot of things to choose from. You can go through all 10, you think, okay, that's the most important. If you actually have something like a ready queue, so you've actually seen here that there's a couple of cards that have been analysed and wait for somebody to pick them up and do some coding. Instead of having half a dozen cards to choose from, they've got a choice of 2, so it's very quick to make that choice. So they can basically look at these 2 and think, well, which is the most valuable thing to do next? And they can even go and ask somebody, say, well, I've got these 2 things, which do you want me to do? So rather than giving a big list, rather than having to have a big sort of planning meeting, you've got a limited kind of decision making there, so it should make it a lot quicker. And if not, then you can think about why it's not doing that. So it's nice to kind of break this up and see the difference between what people are actually doing and what they consider has been finished. And also you can see whether people are kind of doing too much, if they're working on too much. Basically covered that really. So when you first create a board, again, the idea about Kanban is not to change your process, it's to understand it so that you can change it effectively. Because if you actually understand what you're doing, then you have a better understanding of the implications of any changes that you apply. So often when you let the board run, then it gets very busy. Lots of stories pile up. People are multitasking because it's very hard not to. It's kind of almost like a modern thought-working disease that people kind of multitask because everybody's so busy and rushed. So when you lay out the board there, the teams design, because they've designed it themselves, they're pretty honest about what they're doing. And so they basically get used to putting up all the work they're doing, and they highlight where. So in this instance, we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the testing queue that the testers are doing. So it's going to be a while. If there's only one tester, it's going to be a while before any feedback is actually going to be given on any of these stories. So it could be a while before maybe this one has to wait several days before it gets tested. And the more work builds up here, the more you can actually see the blockages, the constraints in the system. And it gives you an opportunity to actually say, well, look, we are actually having problems trying to manage this workload. What can we do about it? It's very useful information to take back to management if you're having problems introducing new ideas, saying, well, this is how we're working, we're overloaded. You can see we're overloaded. You can't hide from that. Whereas managers can sometimes kind of say, well, just work harder. Well, this is how hard we're working, but we're always switching from these tasks. It's easier for people who are not used to negotiating with other people or management to have that discussion, because it's not an easy discussion to have to say, well, okay, we're working too hard. Nobody wants to kind of admit that. So these kind of facts you put on there are very hard to hide from because you're putting them on the wall. So if you are having too much work, what else can we do? There's something called WIP limits, so work in progress limits. Nothing to do with WIPs or sadomasochism or anything like that, unfortunately. So it goes to the idea of trying to do one thing at once. So, and there are no hard and fast rules about what limits to apply. So there is a lot of experimentation. Most people start with mapping it to the resources that they have. So in this example, we have, in the team we have one tester, so we've defined a WIP limit of 1. So they're only doing one thing at once. And you can see that there's an even bigger queue in the coding queue. So they've coded a lot of things, but the tester is only doing one, so they're going to have a never-ending queue of things that just sat there. So the code's been written, maybe they've done some unit tests, maybe they've done some exception tests, but there's nobody there to actually do the QA, do the testing, because there's only one poor person there. So you can have a discussion about, is there enough resources there? Are we writing code that's actually testable? Is it taking that person 5 minutes to do the test, or is it taking them 5 days to test each one? with this board, you can actually see that. You can actually understand that. You can actually take metrics on the time each car, the time the car is in each queue. So you can kind of learn as you're going along as the board is running. So if the developers are cranking out lots of code, then maybe they should actually stop writing code and do something more useful. Maybe learn TDD or BDD, or think about how they're actually doing their work. Again, they may be creating some unit tests. They may think they're doing the right thing, but because they're not getting enough feedback from the tester, or they're not being able to make themselves effective. So it could be that they're making lots of bugs accidentally and making very similar bugs, but if they're not getting feedback, then they have to keep reworking a lot of stories over and over again. So when you start putting these WIP limits on, so in this case we've got one tester and 6 devs, but they're pairing. So we put a WIP limit of 3, so we're doing 3 stories at once, so each pair is working on one story. And so then we can't actually take any more work from the analysis stuff until one of these cards has been moved into the ready slot. And we're limiting this work in progress, then it means that these 3 kind of people, these 3 kind of roles, are going to talk to each other much sooner than they would do. So rather than sort of days and weeks, it's going to be hours, minutes and hours before they actually, one person's work will hit somebody else. So if you write some code and immediately give it to a tester and they test it, then you get much more useful feedback because you remember what you've just done. So if there's a problem, you can fix it quicker. If you write a piece of code on Monday and it's not tested until Friday, how much do you actually remember what you actually did and why you did it? So if there's a problem, then you have to go through, your brain has to go through all the code you did that week to work out why you did something on Monday and how best to fix it. Whereas if it's straight away, it's more immediately obvious how you should fix that bug. And if you create a bug on Monday, you might create the same bug on Tuesday, and the same bug on Wednesday, and the same bug on Thursday. So if they're all tested on Friday, you have 5 stories with the same bug. They all get shipped back to you, so that's all those stories you have to work on again. And if you can get that feedback right across the team, or even the organisation, then it means that you're actually, the less work you're actually having progress throughout the whole team, the more feedback you're getting across the whole organisation. And therefore, the sooner you are addressing any issues that are actually coming up. And one way to do this is to have these WIP limits. Another way is to reduce the size of these tasks, reduce the size of the stories. So rather than kind of having a planning, who does planning code? Anybody do planning code? So it's a really interesting idea, but then do you always kind of agree on the sizes of things?
Not necessarily.
Exactly. So it is difficult because until you've done something, you don't know exactly how long something's going to take. This is the conundrum of estimation. Somebody asks you how long it's going to take. Well, unless you've done it before exactly the same way, in exactly the same circumstances, you don't know with any certainty. There could be plenty of things that come up and crop up. But if you've done the same thing over and over again, in very similar circumstances, you can see on average how long it takes. So with this thing, if you're doing smaller stories, they're getting across the board quicker, you're getting feedback quicker, so you can learn how to do the stories quicker and how to be more effective in delivering those stories. So once you start getting that fast feedback, it is circular, it builds on itself and helps you kind of improve it. If you understand that feedback, it helps you improve and get more effective in delivering stories. So rather than things taking several weeks to get across, you can get stories across in less than a week. And some teams will actually get them across in a few days from end to end. So in that way, they can be very, very predictable in what they're delivering. So there is no point in actually asking them, how long is something going to take? You don't have to do planning poker. You discuss, you think about sizes of work. And so rather than doing planning poker, you're actually trying to minimize the amount of work in each story. So you probably do a little bit more initially to break down the stories. But as you're working through this, you're getting feedback about how big a story is. So you're learning each time how well you are, how good you are at breaking down those stories. So with planning poker, if you're taking if you're getting metrics on how accurate you are, then planning poker is still very useful. But most people kind of don't take those metrics. Whereas a lot of Kanban boards actually encourage you to write that sort of stuff down on the card as it's going along. So you can see how long it takes. Was it a good estimate? Did we learn anything? Did we get it right? Were we close enough to not have to kind of spend a lot of time estimating, which most people consider as a wasteful task. So that's kind of a summary, really, of those aspects. So playing around with work in progress limits is something you need to experiment on exactly how to do it. You shouldn't be a slave to them, but you shouldn't just override them willy-nilly. They are useful as a way to get feedback. So if you change them, there should be a reason to change them, not just because somebody comes along and says, well, you should be able to do more than that. So getting the predictability is what the width limits really help you to do. So if you're going to change them, you need to consider what that effect is going to have on your predictability. Often you get the manager who is enthusiastic about what he's trying to achieve. He's trying to get things delivered really quickly. He's got deadlines, he's got promises, commitments to make. So often they are not able to spend the time to think about what is the most valuable thing to do. So they're coming along and giving you conflicting priorities during the day, during the week, and actually forcing you to kind of task switch. So getting you to switch between tasks. I've seen this the most in support roles. You have people in the support desk and they come along, there's a crisis, and then there's another crisis, and then there's another crisis. So somebody has 3 or 4 major tasks they need to do that day, and they end up not doing any of them because they get the one task and that's a crisis, then an hour later they have to do another one. In the meantime, they haven't finished the first one. And the manager comes to the end of the day and says, well, why haven't you actually completed any of these? And it's very hard for that person to say, well, I've been changing all these times, because they don't know, they feel disappointed that they haven't achieved anything. And if you have something like even a simple Kanban, I've done ones where we have like a keyboard Kanban. So you have your keyboard, some post-it notes, you get a priority issue, that's what you're working on. If somebody else comes along, you put another post-it note down with the issue on, and that goes underneath, and you get a little pile. So every time somebody comes up, you're still working on what the first priority until it's done, and you get this whole kind of stream of post-it notes. And eventually people realise that you're busy, they get the message, and they actually help you rather than giving you more work to do. And you feel better because you can actually say, I've done something. You moved that, once you finish that post-it note, you move to the other side of the keyboard, say, I've done that one, I can work on the next one now. And if you have to, you can go back and say, well, I've now got 6 priorities. They're all urgent, but which one's the most valuable to do? So using Kanban, it asks the difficult questions of the rest of the business. And that difficult question is, what's the most valuable thing to do next? And most organizations don't really know the answer to that, because they don't get enough time to think about it. So in theory, in essence, really, you're creating this idea of a pull system. So work is being pulled across at your capability of actually being able to do it, rather than work being pushed on you and you having to task switch all the time. So what else can we do? Something contagious for if you're doing Scrum. A lot of people do spend a lot of time grooming the backlog. I know some Scrum Masters like to talk about this quite a lot. I like to get you to consider dropping the backlog altogether. Because if it's in the backlog and it hasn't come out of the backlog, and if it's been there a while, you're talking about it over and over again, is it any real value? Is it actually causing you more work and actually reducing the value you can deliver each time? Because you think, well, okay, we could all do these things, but if it's not that important, if it's important, it would have been done already. If it's not important, it's still sat in the backlog. I have a Kanban board for the current work I do, and if something's in the backlog for long enough, it just gets deleted. Because if it's important, it'll come around again. So while it's interesting exercise to go through your requirements as a team, you shouldn't really be a slave to kind of brewing the backlog and going through all those things, because if they are really important, then they'll become immediate for the whole team, and people will be talking about it. It won't be you trying to make that decision. The company will be getting behind that story that needs delivered and giving you reasons why it should be delivered. It's also kind of, if you've got a huge amount of tasks to choose from, it's quite demoralizing because you never feel like you're achieving something. So it's quite important, just go back for a second, it's quite important to have this done column, so you can actually see that you've actually done something. It's a very, whether it be a physical board or a virtual board, it's very useful to have the fact that you've got a sense that at the end of the week or the end of the month you can see all the work that you've done. So you know you've been working hard, even if somebody else comes along and says you need to work hard, you say, well, we can't. We've done all this stuff, how much harder can we really work? Is there any questions so far? Any bit of time?
Yes. I think I didn't get the point on drop the backlog. I don't understand, because I don't know Kanban. I just know a bit Scrum method.
Yeah. So as the example here, unless you're actually actively defining the work, the longer you sort of spend working on the story, the kind of potential is that you're going to get less value from it. Because if you have to keep going back and revisiting something in the backlog, you may review it several times before you actually work on it. And that's kind of that's potential waste. So especially if you're going over the same ground, over the same stories, if you're kind of deciding whether you should do it or not, then, well, it's probably not that interesting. The stories that you need to do should be very apparent, and if they're not, it's a failure for the business to communicate that information to you, which is something therefore you need to address. So if you get away from the backlog, then the business is having to have more dialogue with you, telling you every day or every week what is important, rather than you wondering what is important, rather than the software development team kind of thinking, well, what should we do? The business said this, but next week they'll say something else. So it's a way to try and get more engagement from the business, and to not spend time wasting on an activity that is of lesser value than what you could be doing in fact shipping code, which has more value.
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
So what you're describing here, is this purely Kanban, or does it have a flavor of Agile? Because what you just mentioned there about letting go of the product backlog, you have those discussions with the product owner and probably senior people in your team. If you don't have that discussion, well, then you're not going to prioritize appropriately and then appropriately scope for your.
What I'm saying is to not do that on a large set of stories, and do it on a very small set of stories that are more immediate. So rather than having a big backlog of like 50, 100 stories kind of thing, or even 20 stories, it's too many, because if you're going through those every week, you're not only kind of go through. So if you can do, say you can do 5 stories a week, what's the point of going through like 40 stories to review your backlog? It's a big waste. If you go through, if you're doing 10 a week, if you're doing 5 stories a week and you go through 10, that makes more sense. There's less potential for waste, is the idea I'm trying to get across. And again, I'm not suggesting you throw it out, I'm just saying make the best use of that backlog, or reduce it, and the important things will come up. I'm going to crack on, but we can talk about that because it's not a big part of the talk.
Just one more question. if one user story fails in testing, for example, would you move it back to the coding column, or would you?
Oh, if you have to move back?
Yeah.
That's another big story as well. I mean, say if you get a bug there are people who say, well, it should be marked as blocked, and then the developer has to come along and fix it. You don't actually keep it in the tester's queue, and somebody comes along and helps them to get that moving again. That's usually a more effective way. But you would record that, so you'd either record that by moving it back, or record it by indicating that the developer had to have more input to get that story done. If you get a developer to come along, then they're more likely to learn from that mistake. But there's no hard and fast rule about it. Where do we get to? What else can we do? So drop the backlog. So there's a lot of things you can do to define information on the card. So every card you put on your Kanban board can have two sides. So you can put just the title of the story on the front, but you can record all sorts of interesting information on the back of the card. Again, how much you do of this capturing information is up to you. I mean, if you're using a tool, a lot of that information can be captured for you. So if you've got an issue tracker or an agile tool that's actually managing your moving the stories, then you'll get that time information carried for you, so you know how long the card has been in each phase, and that way you can actually see if there is any particular bottlenecks in your development process. If everything's kind of taking a big long time in testing, then again that's being shown in the metrics, and you can also use that to see what your capacity is, what your ability is to do something. So again, you have to think about how much information you want to show on the board compared with how much information you're going to do when you actually come and review something. So when you do a retrospective, you can not only kind of understand and review the stories that you did, but also the work you did to get those stories out the door. So you can actually review the process by looking at the Kanban board. Some other things you can do, again, sometimes we do get priorities. Sometimes something is a real emergency. Sometimes a story is a higher priority than everything else. So sometimes you would actually just label it that way. So you put something simple like putting a big red sticker on the story, so everybody knows that that's an important thing, and people shouldn't be taken away from that. Or you can even create an expediting lane so you can actually see where that story is. So everybody in the organisation knows that there's an important task that a lot of people might be working on, and they know that the capacity of that team has changed. Instantly by looking at that board, they can see there's a big red thing going along like a bull through a china shop. So it now is a really bad time to have a status meeting or do HR or do some other activity or do your appraisals. This would be a crazy time to kind of do that, because you can see the team is absolutely maxed out. So you don't start asking them about new requirements, you don't have planning poker sessions, you know what the team is dedicated to working on. One thing to do, if you do have an expediting lane, it's probably because you're getting a lot of things that are having to be expedited, which in itself is something you can consider why you're getting all these things. And maybe you can do something to improve that. So a variation on that, if you are getting a lot of things, and this happens to a lot to sort of system administrators, IT help desk, is that they're constantly inundated with small problems. People coming asking for servers and all that sort of stuff. So the IT team, DevOps team are always getting interrupted. So it's very hard for them to actually do any big tasks. And this may be the same for developers as well. If you're getting a lot of new requirements and they're always urgent kind of thing, the last thing you want to do when you're actually deep in a big job that's going to take you several days is to be sidetracked onto a smaller job. So one of the things I've seen do is people have this idea of a goalkeeper. So if there's a team of 4, you have one person who's responsible for fielding all those extra little tasks, which frees up the other 3 people for doing bigger tasks. So they can focus on what they're doing without interruption. And while this one other person has to deal with all the crap that's happening around them and deal with it, and they can prioritise around that, and only if there's a really important thing that they would even consider bringing somebody else on. So you can again judge the implications of how things are working in your organisation and figure out how best to deal with them. And if you do have a goalie, then don't make it the same person all the time, because they'll leave, because it's a very nasty kind of role to play. There's lots of things you can do to enhance the board information, things like blockers. So when you move between the different roles on the different swim lanes on the board, there should be kind of a clear understanding about what's done in each of those roles. So what does something look like done between analysis and design, or between test and deployment? There should be kind of a clear understanding of when something can actually move along the board. So you shouldn't really get blockers too often. There should be an exception that's kind of raised. Maybe somebody who's going to deploy something is actually going to be ill that day, and so you put a blocker on there. So somebody has a very quick visual clue that somebody else needs to kind of maybe come along and deal with this, because we're kind of busy, we've lost capacity, we need some help, and it's a manager who can come along and actually help the team, rather than sort of bring them all into a meeting and discuss it. They can say, oh yeah, we need an extra resource, I'll pull somebody off the development team because they've got capacity. And again, somebody could do that just by looking at a Kanban board. You could see where the team could help itself very easily. This guy's very busy. You can put in requests for help. So if you're working on a story and there's a challenge that you're not really familiar with, maybe you have to work with a framework you're not familiar with, or there's kind of a deployment script you've never worked with before, or maybe a different server you've not worked before. You put a little identification thing on the story saying, I need some help. So as soon as somebody else has finished their task, they can come along and help you out in that story, maybe go and pair with you. So rather than go around and asking everybody and interrupting anybody else, you put a visual clue on the board, and so as soon as somebody else is free, then they'll help you. So that's making you more effective without detracting from somebody else. And again, you can use these avatars, an avatar from Avatar, to identify who's actually working on what story. So again, people who need a status update, they can see it on the board. When you're having a stand-up, people can see what people are working on. So if you have a stand-up, you don't need to say, I was working on this yesterday, I'm going to work on this today. That's of low value, that discussion, because it's written on the wall, you can see it. You don't need to, it's of limited value when you can think about other things to talk about in those 10 minutes. Things, a lot of people say, well, what did you learn? Yes, this is what I learned yesterday, this is what I hope to learn today. It's a much more valuable exercise because it's helping the rest of the team. It's not just giving them a status update. Pairing doesn't have to be just 2 people. You can have lots of people, especially if you're having a big sort of priority task. You can put everybody on there, and it's very obvious that everybody's kind of working on that story. If you're using avatars, again, you can see when somebody's free as well. So if you need to go and talk to somebody in that team, you know who you can talk to, because they're maybe doing something that are either low priority or they're on their spare time. So again, I think I've touched on this already. So yeah, if you've got all the information there on board, do you really need to stand-ups are really useful to communicate, but what are you actually communicating? If it's communicating stuff that you're standing right next to, then think of something else to talk about, or not have the stand-ups, because having the stand-ups right next to the board, then you can point out opportunities to improve the way you do things rather than saying what you did. what you're doing because it's already there. So overall, it kind of gives you this idea of better understanding of what's really important in your system. So are you creating the real R2D2, or are you creating just a cheap copy? And this helps you understand the work better. It helps you engage with the business better, and the business are able to engage with you better as well, because they can see what you're working on. And if a bunch of stakeholders come walking past and they see you working on stuff that is just the Tesco's value drive, well, they think, well, why aren't we working on project X, which will make us a whole lot more money than this Tesco drive, which isn't going to make us any money whatsoever? So the business, it gives them a channel to engage with what you're doing, and then they can see where the communication is kind of broken down between them and your team. And this all helps kind of get an understanding of the overview of what's going on in your company. And the smaller you do your stories, then again, the quicker you're getting your feedback, the quicker you can actually deploy them. So the quicker you actually deploy stuff, then the less kind of risk you're actually getting, because you're getting feedback not from within the organization itself, but also outside. So you're getting feedback from your customers a lot quicker. So this is an added advantage of making smaller stories and getting them shipped. You understand all the problems that are actually associated with going from an idea to getting something in front of the customer, because you are doing it every day or every week or every month. If you do something if you only deploy once a year, you're only learning once that year. You do something every week, then you're learning something new, how to do something better every week, and you get better at it. So this is really it. Just about wrapping up on time as well. So again, if you visualize it, you can see what the problems are. You manage the work in progress. You're not constantly task switching. You can be more effective. You can maybe bump those 24 hours up to maybe 26 or 28, maybe even 30 if you're lucky. There's always going to be things you have to do that are stopping you delivering value, but with a Kanban board you can see what those are, and you can make an intelligent decision, a fact-based decision about what you can do about it, or if you should do something about it. Maybe it's perfectly fine that you're working at that level of effectiveness for that organisation, and therefore the manager doesn't need to tell you to work any harder, because everybody knows that you're delivering something at an acceptable, a sustainable business rate. And you can be as creative as you want with Kanban boards. You can use a physical board, you can use, there's plenty of software that will help you do these kind of things as well. One thing I would suggest, if you are going to use Kanban, then don't talk about it. Don't say we're going to introduce Kanban. Just like Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club. If you're going to introduce anything really, then don't talk about the fact that you're introducing it, because if it goes wrong, people just blame it. So try things out, try something small. Again, Kanban is nice because it has no impact. All you're doing is visualizing what you're doing already, and then it gives you an opportunity to do more, but you don't have to. And that's it. Thank you very much.